The blood on Georgiana Everett's hands had frozen into her skin by the time she stumbled into Fort Stockton, Texas, in the winter of 1878, her dress torn, and her face numb from more than just the bitter cold that had swept down from the mountains. She had walked for 3 days through the unexpected blizzard that had descended upon West Texas, leaving behind a burning ranch house and 2 bodies she would never be able to forget, no matter how hard she tried. The general store was the first building she reached, its windows glowing with lamplight that seemed impossibly warm, and she pushed through the door with the last of her strength before collapsing onto the wooden floor. Fletcher Calloway looked up from the ledger he had been reviewing, his pen freezing mid-stroke as the door burst open and a woman fell into his store like an apparition from a nightmare. He was around the counter in seconds, his tall frame moving with surprising speed for a man who spent most of his days tallying accounts and stocking shelves. The woman was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair matted to her head and eyes that stared at nothing even as they remained open. Her lips were blue, and when he touched her hand to help her up, he recoiled at how cold her skin felt. "Madam, can you hear me?" His voice was steady, despite the shock coursing through him. Fletcher had seen plenty of trouble in his 26 years, especially in the 5 years since he had left his family's ranch in Oklahoma to start over in Texas. But something about this woman's hollow expression made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. Georgiana tried to speak, but her teeth chattered so violently that no words would form. She could see the man above her, his brown eyes filled with concern beneath the brim of his hat, his face clean-shaven and honest-looking. She wanted to tell him about the raiders who had come in the night, about how they had killed her uncle and his ranch hand before setting fire to everything, about how she had hidden in the root cellar while the world burned above her. But all that came out was a strangled sob, and then tears began to fall, hot against her frozen cheeks. Fletcher did not hesitate. He scooped her up into his arms, surprised at how light she was, and carried her through the back door of his store into the small living quarters he maintained there. The pot-bellied stove in the corner was already burning, filling the room with welcome heat, and he set her down gently in the chair closest to it. She was still crying, the tears coming faster now, and he could see they were washing clean tracks through the dirt on her face. "You are safe now," he said quietly, kneeling in front of her so their eyes were level. "Whatever happened out there, you are safe here." But Georgiana could not stop crying. The tears kept coming, and with them came the reality of everything she had lost. Her uncle had taken her in 6 months ago when her parents died of fever back in St. Louis, giving her a home at his ranch 30 miles north of Fort Stockton. It had not been much, but it had been hers. Now she had nothing but the ruined dress on her back and memories that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Fletcher watched her cry for a moment longer, then made a decision. He stepped outside briefly, and when he returned, his hands were full of clean snow from the drift that had accumulated against the side of his building. The snow was still falling outside, unusual for this part of Texas, but not unheard of during the coldest months. He knelt again and gently pressed the snow against her face, wiping away the tears and the grime and the blood. "Snow covered her tears," he murmured, more to himself than to her, as he carefully cleaned her face. The cold seemed to bring her back to herself somehow, her eyes focusing on his face as he worked. When he was satisfied that she was clean, he tossed the reddened snow into a bucket and took her hands in his. "You will only know warmth now, I promise you that." Something in his voice, in the absolute certainty of his words, made Georgiana believe him. She looked at this stranger who had appeared in her darkest moment like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. "They killed him," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "My uncle. They killed Tom, too. I hid like a coward while they burned everything." Fletcher shook his head firmly. "You survived. That is not cowardice. That is strength." He stood and moved to a small cabinet, pulling out a thick wool blanket that he wrapped around her shoulders. "My name is Fletcher Calloway. This is my store, and you are welcome to stay here as long as you need. Georgiana Everett." Her voice was steadier now, though it still trembled. "I have nowhere else to go. Then you stay here." He said it as though it were the simplest thing in the world, as though taking in a traumatized stranger was something he did every day. In truth, Fletcher had been lonely for longer than he cared to admit. Running a general store was respectable work, but it did not fill the empty spaces in a man's heart. Something about Georgiana, even in her broken state, called to something deep inside him. He made her tea from the supplies in his store, strong and sweet, and watched as she drank it with shaking hands. The color was slowly returning to her face, though the haunted look in her green eyes remained. She was beautiful, he realized, beneath the trauma and exhaustion. Not the delicate beauty of the women in the Sears catalogs that sometimes came through his store, but something more real and resilient. "You said raiders," Fletcher said after a while, his voice careful. "Did you recognize any of them?" Georgiana closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. Then, slowly, she nodded. "One of them. Jack Morrison. He used to work for my uncle, but there was trouble. Uncle Henry caught him stealing and fired him 6 weeks ago. Jack swore he would make him pay." Fletcher's jaw tightened. He knew Morrison by reputation, a man who drifted from ranch to ranch, never staying long before he was run off for one reason or another. "How many were with him?" "3 others. I did not see their faces clearly." She opened her eyes and looked at him directly. "Are you going to go after them?" "That is a job for the law," Fletcher said, though his tone suggested he had little faith in that solution. The nearest proper lawman was in Fort Davis, nearly 60 miles away over rough terrain, and by the time word reached him, Morrison and his gang would be long gone. "Right now, my job is making sure you are safe and warm." The way he said it, with such simple conviction, made something crack in Georgiana's chest. She had been strong for so long, first nursing her dying parents and then adjusting to life on a rough cattle ranch where she was expected to earn her keep. She had learned to rope and ride, to cook for ranch hands and mend their clothes, to keep her head down and her complaints to herself. But this man, this stranger, was offering her something she had not had in a very long time, the freedom to be vulnerable. She started crying again, but this time it was different. These tears were not the frozen, desperate tears of before, but something cleaner, almost healing. Fletcher moved his chair closer to hers and, after a moment's hesitation, put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, letting herself take comfort from his solid presence. They sat like that for a long time, the stove crackling beside them and the wind howling outside. Fletcher found himself noticing details about her. The way her hair, now starting to dry, curled slightly at the ends, the small scar on her wrist that looked old, the way her breathing gradually steadied as exhaustion overtook trauma. He had never considered himself a particularly protective man, but something about Georgiana brought out an instinct he had not known he possessed. "You should sleep," he said eventually. "You are exhausted." "I do not want to sleep." Her voice was small. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the fire." Fletcher understood. He had his own memories that haunted his dreams, though nothing as fresh or terrible as what she had endured. "Then I will stay awake with you. We can talk or sit in silence. Whatever you need." So they talked. At first it was just small things, Fletcher telling her about his store and the rhythms of life in Fort Stockton, a town that existed primarily to supply the nearby ranches and serve as a way station for travelers heading further west. He told her about the fort itself, built years earlier and still manned by a small military presence, and about the mix of ranchers, merchants, and drifters who made up the town's population of a few hundred souls. Gradually, as the night wore on and Georgiana felt safer, she began to tell him her story. About growing up in St. Louis as the only child of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, about the fever that had taken them both within a week of each other the previous spring, about the uncle she had barely known agreeing to take her in, and the long journey west to a life so different from everything she had known, about learning to love the vast emptiness of West Texas despite herself, the way the sunsets painted the sky in colors she had never imagined, and the stars at night seemed close enough to touch. "I was just starting to feel like I belonged somewhere," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "And now that is gone too." "You belong here," Fletcher heard himself say. "If you want to stay in Fort Stockton, you belong here." She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You do not even know me. I know enough." He met her gaze steadily. "I know you are strong enough to survive 3 days in a blizzard. I know you are brave enough to keep going even when you have every reason to give up. That is enough for me." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection neither of them fully understood but both recognized as significant. Georgiana felt it like a warm current flowing through her cold, damaged body, a promise of safety and something more. Fletcher felt it as a certainty settling into his bones, the knowledge that this woman had just changed his life in ways he could not yet comprehend. Dawn was breaking by the time Georgiana finally allowed herself to sleep, curled up in Fletcher's bed while he took the chair by the stove. He watched her sleeping face, peaceful despite everything, and felt something he had been missing for years finally click into place. He had come to Texas to escape his family's expectations and make his own way in the world, but until this moment, he had not realized how lonely that independence had made him. The snow had stopped falling when Fletcher finally opened his store that morning, though several inches blanketed the ground, a strange and beautiful sight in West Texas. His regular customers noticed the change in him immediately, the way he seemed distracted and more protective of the back room than usual. Martha Donovan, who ran the boarding house down the street, was particularly curious. "You have got someone back there," she said with the bluntness of a woman who had lived 60 years without learning tact. "I can tell." Fletcher saw no reason to lie. "A woman came in last night, half frozen and in trouble. She is resting now." Martha's eyes sharpened with interest and concern. "What kind of trouble?" So Fletcher told her, at least the broad strokes. Martha's expression grew grimmer as she listened, and when he finished, she nodded decisively. "I will bring over some proper clothes for her. Can't have her walking around in whatever she came in wearing. And soup. I will make soup." True to her word, Martha returned within the hour carrying a bundle of clothes and a pot of beef stew that smelled like heaven. She insisted on meeting Georgiana, who had woken and ventured out of the back room looking slightly less haunted than the night before. The two women took to each other immediately, Martha's maternal bossiness somehow exactly what Georgiana needed. "You will stay with Fletcher until we figure out what to do next," Martha declared, brooking no argument. "This is a good man, and you are safe with him. But if you need a woman to talk to, you come find me." "Understand," Georgiana nodded, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. In St. Louis, no one had offered her help when her parents died. The neighbors had expressed sympathy, but practical assistance had been scarce. Here, in this rough frontier town, People she had never met were opening their hearts to her without hesitation. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Fletcher would open his store each morning while Georgiana rested or helped with small tasks in the back room. She proved to have a good head for numbers and neat handwriting, and soon she was helping him update his ledgers, finding errors and inefficiencies that had plagued him for months. They worked side by side in companionable silence, occasionally broken by conversation that grew easier and more natural each day. In the evenings, after he closed the store, they would sit by the stove and talk. Fletcher learned about Georgiana's love of reading, a passion frustrated by the scarcity of books on her uncle's ranch. He immediately offered her access to his small but carefully curated collection, watching her face light up with joy as she examined each volume. She learned about his family, the parents and 4 brothers he had left behind in Oklahoma when he struck out on his own, the complicated feelings of love and resentment that had driven him to seek independence. "You miss them?" she asked one night, a week after her arrival. Fletcher considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, but I do not miss the person I was expected to be. My father wanted me to run the ranch with my brothers, to marry a local girl and settle into a life that had already been mapped out for me. I wanted more than that. Or maybe just something different." Georgiana understood that feeling better than he knew. "My mother wanted me to marry a clerk she knew, a nice boring man who would have given me a nice boring life. I think that is why I said yes when Uncle Henry offered to take me in, even though I had never been further west than Jefferson City. I wanted to see what else was possible. And now," Fletcher asked quietly, "now I do not know." She looked at him, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "Everything I thought I knew about what I wanted changed in one night. But being here with you, it feels right somehow. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense to Fletcher. Every day he spent with Georgiana, he became more certain that she was meant to be part of his life. Not out of pity or obligation, but because she fit into the empty spaces he had not realized existed. She made him laugh with her dry observations about his customers. She challenged him when she thought he was being too cautious or too rigid in his thinking. She made the small room behind his store feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. He was falling in love with her. The realization came to him one afternoon as he watched her serving a customer, her smile genuine even though he knew she was still processing her trauma. He had never believed in love at first sight, had always thought it was something made up by poets and dreamers. But this, whatever it was growing between them, felt as real and necessary as breathing. The question was whether she felt the same way, and whether it was right to even hope for that so soon after everything she had lost. The answer came sooner than he expected. 2 weeks after Georgiana's arrival, a man rode into Fort Stockton asking questions about a woman matching her description. Fletcher was in the store when he heard about it from Timothy Grant, one of the ranch hands who occasionally bought supplies from him. "Fellow down at the saloon is looking for someone," Timothy said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Says he is trying to find a woman who might have survived a ranch fire up north. Described her pretty well, actually." Fletcher felt cold dread settle in his stomach. "What did this fellow look like?" "Mean," Timothy said bluntly. "The kind of mean that is looking for trouble." Said his name was Morrison. Fletcher's hands clenched into fists. Jack Morrison had come to Fort Stockton, either brazenly confident or dangerously stupid. Where is he now? Still at the saloon, drinking and asking questions. Nobody has told him anything yet, but you know how it is. Enough whiskey and someone will talk. Fletcher nodded grimly. He waited until Timothy left, then locked the front door of his store and went into the back room where Georgiana was mending one of his shirts. She looked up with a smile that faded when she saw his expression. "What is wrong?" He told her, watching the color drain from her face. "You need to stay hidden. Morrison cannot know you are here." But Georgiana stood up, setting aside the mending with hands that shook only slightly. "He will find out eventually. Fort Stockton is not big enough to keep secrets for long." "Then we need to go to the fort, talk to Captain Reynolds. Get proper protection." Fletcher was already moving, pulling his gun belt from its hook on the wall. He had not worn it in months, preferring the peaceful life of a shopkeeper, but he had not forgotten how to use it. Georgiana caught his arm. "Fletcher, wait. Think about this. If Morrison is asking questions openly, it means he is confident no one can touch him. He probably has his gang nearby. Going to the army might provoke him into doing something rash." She was right, and Fletcher hated it. Fort Stockton's military presence was minimal, more symbolic than effective, and Captain Reynolds was a bureaucrat who would probably insist on sending word to Fort Davis and waiting for proper authority before acting. By then, Morrison could have done anything. "So what do you suggest?" Fletcher asked, frustration clear in his voice. Georgiana met his eyes steadily. "I suggest we make sure I am never alone and that you are armed at all times. Morrison is a coward. He only attacked the ranch because he had surprise and superior numbers. If he knows I am protected, he might think twice." It was not a perfect plan, but it was better than nothing. Fletcher agreed reluctantly, and for the next 3 days they lived in a state of constant tension. Georgiana stayed in the back room except for early mornings and late evenings when the store was closed. Fletcher kept his revolver within reach at all times and slept with one eye open. Morrison stayed in town, drinking and gambling and making his presence known. He had 2 men with him, hard-faced drifters who looked like they would kill for the price of a drink. The townspeople gave them a wide berth, and Fletcher heard through the gossip network that Martha Donovan had been spreading the word to keep quiet about any strangers, especially female ones. The confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Morrison walked into Fletcher's store on the 4th day, his steps unsteady from drink but his eyes sharp and mean. Fletcher was behind the counter, his hand resting casually near his revolver. "I am looking for someone," Morrison said without preamble. "A woman, dark hair, early 20s. Heard she might have passed through here after that unfortunate fire at the Everett place." Fletcher kept his expression neutral. "Plenty of women pass through Fort Stockton." "You got a particular reason for looking for this one." Morrison's smile was ugly. "Let us just say she saw something she should not have. I want to make sure she knows to keep her mouth shut." "Or what?" Fletcher's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. The smile faded from Morrison's face. "Or she might have the same accident as her uncle. These things happen out here." Fletcher moved before he fully thought about what he was doing. He had his revolver out and pointed at Morrison's chest in one smooth motion, years of practice making the draw almost faster than the eye could follow. "Get out of my store." Morrison raised his hands slowly, his expression ugly. "You are making a mistake, shopkeeper. I got friends. And I got a gun pointed at your heart. Seems to me my situation is better than yours right now." Fletcher's hand was steady. "You are going to walk out of here, get on your horse and ride out of Fort Stockton. If I see you or your friends in this town again, I will put a bullet in you." That clear enough? For a long moment, Morrison just stared at him, calculating. Then he spat on the floor and turned toward the door. "This is not over." "Yeah, it is." Fletcher kept the gun trained on him until he was out the door and mounting his horse. Through the window, he watched Morrison ride down the main street toward the saloon where his companions were waiting. Georgiana emerged from the back room, her face pale but determined. "He will come back. Men like that always do." Fletcher holstered his gun and moved to her side. "Then we will deal with it, but I meant what I said. I am not letting him hurt you." She looked up at him, and Fletcher saw in her eyes something he had been hoping for but not daring to expect. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you doing all this for me?" The honest answer was simple, even if the feelings behind it were complex. "Because I love you," Fletcher said, the words coming out more easily than he expected. "I know it is fast, and I know the timing is terrible, but that does not make it less true. I love you, Georgiana, and I will protect you with everything I have." Tears filled her eyes, but these were not tears of grief or fear. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since that first night when you wiped the snow from my face and promised me warmth. But I was afraid to say it, afraid it was just gratitude or trauma or something other than real." "It is real," Fletcher said, pulling her into his arms. "This is the most real thing I have ever felt." They kissed then, soft and tentative at first, then with growing passion and certainty. Georgiana felt something broken inside her begin to heal, the warmth Fletcher had promised finally reaching the frozen places in her heart. Fletcher felt complete in a way he never had before, as though he had been waiting his entire life for this woman to stumble into his store. The moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. They pulled apart to see a bottle lying in the middle of the store floor, whiskey spreading across the boards. Through the broken window, they could see Morrison and his men on horseback, their faces twisted with malice. "You made your choice, shopkeeper," Morrison shouted. "Now you get to live with it." Fletcher pushed Georgiana toward the back room. "Stay down." He grabbed his gun again and moved to the window, keeping to the side to avoid being an easy target. Morrison and his gang were riding in circles in the street, whooping and shouting, clearly trying to provoke a response. But before Fletcher could decide what to do, Captain Reynolds appeared at the head of a dozen soldiers, their rifles at the ready. The captain was a tall man with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense expression that brooked no defiance. "Jack Morrison," Reynolds called out in a voice used to being obeyed, "you and your men are under arrest for murder and arson. Drop your weapons and dismount, or we will shoot you down where you sit." Morrison looked around wildly, clearly not expecting this turn of events. His hand moved toward his gun, and Fletcher thought for a sick moment that the man was stupid enough to try fighting a dozen armed soldiers. But one of his companions grabbed his arm, hissing something urgent, and Morrison's shoulders sagged in defeat. They dismounted and allowed themselves to be disarmed, though Morrison kept his eyes fixed on Fletcher's store with an expression of pure hatred. Captain Reynolds detailed half his men to take the prisoners to the fort stockade while he walked over to Fletcher's store, his boots crunching on the glass. Fletcher opened the door to meet him. "Captain, thank you," Reynolds nodded. "Miss Donovan came to see me yesterday, told me the whole story. I sent word to Fort Davis and got authorization to make the arrest. We will hold them until the marshal can come collect them." He paused, looking at Fletcher seriously. "She also told me you have been harboring the witness." "I will need to speak with her." Georgiana emerged from the back room, her spine straight despite her obvious fear. "I am Georgiana Everett, Captain. I saw Jack Morrison and his men murder my uncle and his ranch hand before burning the ranch. I will testify to that in any court you want." Reynolds' expression softened slightly. "That took courage, miss. We will need a full statement, but it can wait until tomorrow if you need time." "I will do it now," Georgiana said firmly. "I want this finished." It took several hours for Captain Reynolds to take her statement, with Fletcher sitting beside her the entire time, holding her hand when the memories became too much. She told the captain everything she could remember, every detail about the attack and the men involved. When it was over, Reynolds assured her that Morrison and his gang would hang for their crimes. "You did the right thing, staying alive to testify," Reynolds said as he prepared to leave. Too many men like Morrison get away with murder because there are no witnesses willing to speak up. After the captain left, Fletcher and Georgiana sat together in the growing darkness, neither of them quite able to process that the nightmare was truly over. The threat that had hung over them for days was gone, locked in a stockade and awaiting justice. "It is really finished," Georgiana said wonderingly. "I can stop looking over my shoulder." Fletcher pulled her closer. "And start looking forward instead." "What do you see when you look forward, Georgiana?" She turned in his arms to face him. "I see you, I see us, building a life together here." "If that is what you want too, it is all I want." Fletcher kissed her forehead gently. "Marry me. I know it is fast, and I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life keeping you warm." Georgiana's smile was like the sun coming out after a storm. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the fort's chapel, with half the town in attendance. Martha Donovan cried openly, claiming she had known they were meant for each other from the start. Captain Reynolds gave Georgiana away, having developed a protective fondness for the brave young woman. Fletcher wore his best suit, purchased new for the occasion, and Georgiana wore a dress that Martha and the other women of Fort Stockton had sewn together, their way of welcoming her into the community. The wedding night was gentle and sweet, Fletcher determined to erase the last traces of trauma from Georgiana's memory and replace them with love and tenderness. They made love by lamplight in the room behind the store, discovering each other with a combination of passion and care that left them both breathless and satisfied. "I love you," Georgiana whispered into the darkness, her head resting on Fletcher's chest. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes." Fletcher stroked her hair, feeling a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. "Do not be frightened. I am here, and I am not going anywhere." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, safe and warm while the Texas wind blew cold outside their walls. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Georgiana proved to be an invaluable partner in running the store, her organizational skills and friendly demeanor winning over even the most skeptical customers. Together, they made changes that improved efficiency and profits, expanding their inventory and establishing better relationships with suppliers. But more than business partners, they were building a life together. Fletcher taught Georgiana to shoot, insisting she know how to defend herself even though the threat from Morrison was gone. The outlaw and his gang had been hanged in Fort Davis after a swift trial where Georgiana's testimony had proven damning. She had watched them hang, Fletcher beside her, and felt nothing but relief that they could never hurt anyone else. Georgiana taught Fletcher to appreciate literature and music, reading to him in the evenings and singing songs her mother had taught her. He discovered he loved the sound of her voice, whether speaking or singing, and would often stop what he was doing just to listen to her. They made friends among the townspeople, hosting dinners in the small space behind the store and attending church socials and community events. Fort Stockton was growing, new families arriving regularly as the frontier became more settled, and Fletcher and Georgiana became respected members of the community. 6 months after their wedding, Georgiana realized she was pregnant. She told Fletcher one evening as they were closing the store, her voice nervous and excited. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around until she was laughing and dizzy. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." Georgiana's pregnancy was not easy. The Texas summer heat was brutal, and she suffered from morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon. but Fletcher was attentive and caring, taking over the more physical aspects of running the store and making sure she rested as much as possible. Martha Donovan appointed herself Georgiana's unofficial midwife, dispensing advice and remedies with the confidence of a woman who had birthed 8 children of her own. Their son was born in March of 1880, a healthy baby with Fletcher's brown eyes and Georgiana's dark hair. They named him Henry, after Georgiana's uncle, and Thomas for the ranch hand who had died with him. Henry Thomas Calloway came into the world screaming his displeasure at the cold air, and Fletcher fell in love with him immediately. Watching Fletcher with their son, Georgiana felt her heart overflow with love and gratitude. This man, who had appeared in her darkest hour and promised her warmth, had given her everything she had never dared to hope for: safety, love, family, and a place to belong. The store became more challenging with a baby in residence, but they adapted. Georgiana fashioned a sling that allowed her to carry Henry while working, and customers grew accustomed to the sight of the shopkeeper's wife conducting business with a baby on her hip. Henry proved to be a good-natured child, content to observe the world around him with solemn brown eyes. As Henry grew from infant to toddler, Fort Stockton continued to expand. The railroad was coming, everyone said, which would bring more commerce and more people. Fletcher and Georgiana discussed expanding the store, perhaps buying one of the empty buildings on Main Street and opening a proper mercantile instead of the small general store. They implemented their plan when Henry was 3, purchasing a large building that had been a failed saloon and transforming it into Calloway's mercantile. It was a massive undertaking that required all their savings and a loan from the bank, but within 6 months, they had created something impressive. A 2-story building with living quarters above the store, more inventory than any other establishment between Fort Davis and San Angelo, and a reputation for fair prices and quality goods. The success of the mercantile brought challenges. They needed help, so they hired 2 employees, a young man named Daniel who handled the heavy work and deliveries, and Sarah, a widow who proved excellent with customers. Georgiana trained them both, developing a management style that was firm but fair. Their family grew along with the business. A daughter arrived 2 years after Henry, a beautiful baby girl they named Grace Ann. She had Georgiana's green eyes and a temperament that was both sweet and stubborn. Henry adored his little sister, appointing himself her protector from the moment she came home. Fletcher often marveled at the life they had built. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn when he would wake and watch Georgiana sleeping beside him, he would remember that first night she had stumbled into his store more dead than alive. The journey from that moment to this, from strangers to soulmates to partners in every sense of the word, seemed miraculous. When Grace was 3 and Henry was 5, Fletcher's father came to visit. Jonathan Calloway arrived unannounced, riding into Fort Stockton on a fine horse and asking directions to his son's mercantile. Fletcher saw him through the window and felt a complex mix of emotions: love, resentment, pride, and nervousness. "Father," he said as the older man entered the store, "this is unexpected." Jonathan Calloway was in his 60s now, his hair white but his bearing still strong and commanding. He looked around the mercantile with an appraising eye before turning that gaze on his son. "You have done well for yourself, Fletcher, better than I expected when you left." It was not quite an apology, but coming from Jonathan, it was close. Fletcher felt some of the old tension drain away. "Thank you. Let me introduce you to your daughter-in-law and grandchildren." Georgiana handled the introduction with grace, despite her surprise at meeting Fletcher's father for the first time. She had heard enough stories to be wary, But Jonathan was unexpectedly charming with her and absolutely besotted with his grandchildren. Henry, at 5, was old enough to be fascinated by his grandfather's stories of ranching and cattle drives, while Grace climbed into Jonathan's lap with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. Jonathan stayed for a week, and during that time, he and Fletcher began to rebuild their relationship. The older man admitted that he had been wrong to try to force Fletcher into a life he did not want, and Fletcher acknowledged that he could have handled his departure with more grace and less anger. By the time Jonathan prepared to leave, they had reached an understanding that felt like peace. "You chose well," Jonathan told Fletcher on his last evening, watching Georgiana play with the children. "She is strong, that wife of yours, stronger than she looks." Fletcher agreed completely. Georgiana's strength was not the obvious kind, but it ran deep. She had survived tragedy and trauma, had rebuilt her life from nothing, and had created a home filled with love and laughter. She was the foundation on which their entire life was built. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Henry started school, proving to be bright and curious. Grace followed 2 years later, her quick mind and mischievous nature keeping her teachers on their toes. The mercantile continued to thrive, becoming a cornerstone of Fort Stockton's economy. In 1887, when Henry was 7 and Grace was 5, Georgiana discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the previous 2, perhaps because she was more experienced or perhaps because this baby was simply more cooperative. Fletcher joked that it meant they were having a girl, calm and reasonable from the start. He was wrong. Their third child was another boy, born in the spring of 1888 and named William after Fletcher's youngest brother. William had his mother's dark hair and his father's solid build. And from the start, he was determined to keep up with his older siblings no matter what. Life was full and busy, and exactly what Fletcher and Georgiana had dreamed of during those early uncertain days of their relationship. The mercantile was successful enough to provide a comfortable living and some luxuries. They had added a parlor to their living quarters, where Georgiana kept her books and Fletcher his collection of maps. They had photographs on the walls, a new innovation that Georgiana loved, capturing moments of their growing family. The children grew and thrived. Henry developed a passion for numbers and business, often helping his father with the mercantile's accounts. Grace discovered a love of music, and they saved up to buy her a piano that dominated one corner of the parlor. William was still young but showed signs of inheriting his father's practical nature and his mother's determination. On their 10th anniversary, Fletcher took Georgiana to San Antonio for a week, leaving the children with Martha Donovan and trusting their employees to manage the store. It was the first time they had been truly alone since Henry's birth, and they reveled in the freedom to focus entirely on each other. They stayed at a fine hotel, ate at restaurants, and explored the city like tourists. But more importantly, they talked about everything and nothing, reconnecting as not just parents and business partners, but as the man and woman who had fallen in love in the midst of tragedy. "Are you happy?" Fletcher asked her one evening as they sat on the hotel balcony watching the sun set over the city. Georgiana took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible. There are still days when I think about that night, about the fire and the cold and how lost I felt. But then, I remember you wiping the snow from my face and promising me warmth, and I realize that you have given me so much more than that. You have given me a life, Fletcher. A real, full, beautiful life." Fletcher pulled her close, kissing her temple. "You gave me the same thing. I was just existing before you arrived, going through the motions. You made me want to really live." They made love that night with the tenderness and passion of people who knew each other completely, who had weathered storms together and come out stronger. Afterwards, lying in each other's arms, Georgiana thought about how far they had come from that desperate night in 1878. When they returned to Fort Stockton, it was to a warm welcome from their children and news that the railroad would definitely be coming through town. The announcement brought a flurry of activity and speculation about what it would mean for the community. Fletcher and Georgiana discussed expanding again, perhaps adding a warehouse to store goods that could be shipped in bulk once the railroad arrived. The railroad reached Fort Stockton in 1890, transforming the town almost overnight. What had been a small frontier community became a bustling hub of commerce. Calloway's mercantile adapted and grew with it, and Fletcher's decision to build the warehouse proved prescient. They became one of the major suppliers for the region, their reputation for quality and fair dealing bringing in business from ranches and towns 50 miles in any direction. With success came challenges and opportunities. They hired more employees, eventually employing a dozen people between the mercantile and the warehouse. Fletcher traveled more frequently to negotiate with suppliers, while Georgiana managed the day-to-day operations with an efficiency that impressed everyone who worked for her. Despite the demands of business, they remained devoted to their children and to each other. Family dinners were sacred, a time when they all gathered to share their days and stay connected. Fletcher taught all 3 children to ride and shoot, skills that remained important even as the frontier became more civilized. Georgiana taught them to read and think critically, to be kind but not weak, to stand up for what was right. Henry graduated from the local school at 16 and expressed interest in attending college back east. It was a difficult decision for Fletcher and Georgiana, the idea of their eldest child being so far away, but they recognized his ambition and intelligence deserved the opportunity. They sent him to a business college in Missouri, where he excelled and eventually decided to specialize in law. Grace, at 14, was becoming a talented musician. She gave lessons to younger children and performed at church and community events. She had also inherited her mother's organizational skills and often helped manage the mercantile's accounts. Fletcher joked that between Henry's legal mind and Grace's business sense, they would never have to worry about being cheated. William, at 10, was still finding his path. He loved the outdoors and talked about becoming a rancher when he grew up, much to his grandfather Jonathan's delight. The elder Calloway visited regularly now, having developed a close relationship with all 3 of his grandchildren. In 1895, Fort Stockton was thriving, and so was the Calloway family. Their mercantile was the most successful business in town. Their children were healthy and happy, and Fletcher and Georgiana's love had only deepened over the 17 years since they had met. They had weathered challenges together, from difficult business decisions to the normal trials of raising children, and emerged stronger each time. One evening in the fall of that year, after the children had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Fletcher and Georgiana sat together on the porch of their home above the mercantile. The air was cooling after the brutal summer heat, and stars filled the sky in the way they only did in West Texas. "Do you ever think about that night?" Fletcher asked, not needing to specify which night he meant. "The night you arrived." Georgiana leaned her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes. Usually when I am feeling particularly grateful for what we have built. I was so lost then, so certain that my life was over before it had really begun. And then you appeared like some kind of miracle, promising me warmth." "I did not know what I was promising," Fletcher admitted. "I just knew I could not let you stay cold and afraid." And then I got to know you, and I realized I wanted to keep that promise forever." "You have," Georgiana said softly. "Every single day you have kept that promise. Even on the hard days, even when we have disagreed or struggled, I have always felt that warmth." "It is not just physical warmth, Fletcher. It is the warmth of being loved completely, of having a partner who sees me and values me and chooses me every day." Fletcher tightened his arm around her. "That is exactly how you make me feel, like I am chosen every day. Like I matter in a way I never did before." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the town around them. Fort Stockton had grown from a frontier outpost to a proper town, with electric lights beginning to replace oil lamps and talk of telephone lines coming soon. The world was changing rapidly, the Wild West of Fletcher's youth fading into history, but some things remained constant. The love between a husband and wife, the bonds of family, the satisfaction of building something meaningful with your own hands and determination. These things did not change, no matter how much the world around them transformed. "I want to take you somewhere," Fletcher said suddenly. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds. Will you come with me?" Georgiana smiled. "Always." The next day, Fletcher borrowed horses from a friend who still ran a stable, and they rode north out of town. Georgiana had not been on a horse in years, focused as she had been on the business and raising children, but the skill came back quickly. It felt wonderful to ride across the open country, the wind in her hair and the sun on her face. They rode for over an hour before Fletcher stopped at the top of a rise that overlooked a stretch of rough but beautiful land. "This is it," he said, dismounting and helping Georgiana down. "This is where your uncle's ranch was, or close to it anyway." Georgiana stood looking at the land where she had once lived, where she had lost so much. Nature had reclaimed it in the 17 years since the fire. There was no trace of the buildings that had stood here, just scrub brush and rocks and the vast sky overhead. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, not upset but curious. Fletcher took her hand. "Because I wanted you to see that the past does not have power over us anymore. This land, these memories, they are just part of your story, but they are not the whole story, not even close." Georgiana looked around, and Fletcher was right. She felt nothing but a distant sadness for her uncle and Tom, the kind of grief that had been processed and accepted. The terror and helplessness of that night had faded, replaced by everything she had built since then. "The whole story is you and me and our children," she said, squeezing his hand. "It is the mercantile and our home and the life we have created. That night was just the beginning, not the ending." "Exactly." Fletcher pulled her close, kissing her there on the site of her greatest tragedy, reclaiming it with love. "I love you, Georgiana Calloway. I have loved you since the moment I saw you, and I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "Thank you for wiping away my tears that night. Thank you for keeping your promise." They stayed there for a while, holding each other on the windswept rise, before riding back to town and the life that waited for them. It was a good life, full of work and family and love. It was the life that had grown from that desperate night in 1878, when a frozen, traumatized woman had stumbled into a general store and found not just warmth, but everything she had ever needed. The years continued their steady march forward. Henry graduated from law school and returned to Texas, though he settled in San Angelo rather than Fort Stockton, opening a practice that quickly became successful. He married a teacher named Rebecca, and they gave Fletcher and Georgiana their first grandchildren, twin boys born in 1900. Grace married at 21 to a rancher's son named Michael, a good man who loved her music and supported her ambitions. They built a home on Michael's family ranch, and Grace continued to teach piano while also managing the ranch's accounts. She gave birth to a daughter in 1902, a beautiful baby girl they named Georgiana in honor of her grandmother. William did become a rancher, partnering with his grandfather Jonathan to expand the Calloway Ranch in Oklahoma. He married late, at 28, to a spirited woman named Catherine who could rope and ride as well as any man. Their first child was born in 1906, a son they named Fletcher. Through all these changes and expansions of their family, Fletcher and Georgiana remained the center, the foundation on which everything else was built. They gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the mercantile, hiring a manager they trusted and transitioning into more of an advisory role. This gave them time to travel, visiting their children and grandchildren, and to simply enjoy each other's company. In 1908, on their 30th anniversary, their children arranged a surprise celebration in Fort Stockton. Family came from all over Texas and Oklahoma, along with friends they had made over 3 decades in the community. The party was held at the Mercantile, which was decorated with flowers and ribbons, and a photographer captured images of Fletcher and Georgiana surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Looking at those photographs later, Georgiana marveled at the life they had created. She was 52 years old now, her dark hair threaded with silver, her face showing the lines of a life well lived. Fletcher was 56, his brown hair more gray than not, his solid frame still strong but moving a bit slower than it once had. But the love in their eyes when they looked at each other was as bright and real as it had been 30 years earlier. "We did well," Fletcher said, holding one of the photographs. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." Georgiana leaned against him, fitting perfectly into his side as she always had. "We did it together. That is what made the difference." They had a few more good years, continuing to watch their family grow and thrive. More grandchildren arrived, and Fletcher and Georgiana spoiled them all appropriately. They took a grand trip to San Francisco in 1910, marveling at the city and the ocean and how much the world had changed since their youth. They attended the weddings of several of their grandchildren, watching the family tree branch and expand. Fletcher died peacefully in his sleep in 1913 at the age of 61. His heart simply stopped, the doctor said, worn out from a life fully lived. Georgiana woke that morning to find him beside her, looking peaceful, and though her grief was profound, she was grateful that he had gone without pain or suffering. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the respect and affection Fletcher had earned in his 40 years in Fort Stockton. His children and grandchildren gathered around Georgiana, offering comfort and support, but she knew that a fundamental part of her had died with Fletcher. They had been two halves of a whole for 35 years, and his absence left a void nothing could fill. Georgiana lived for another 12 years, surrounded by family and honored by the community. She remained sharp and engaged, taking an interest in her grandchildren's lives and watching the world transform around her. She saw automobiles replace horses, saw the town grow to a population of several thousand, saw changes she could never have imagined in her youth. But she never stopped missing Fletcher. Every night, she would look at their wedding photograph and remember the promises they had made. Every morning, she would wake reaching for him before remembering he was gone. The warmth he had promised her that first night, the warmth that had sustained her through decades of life, felt dimmed without him. She died in 1925 at the age of 69, surrounded by her children and several of her grandchildren. Her last words were about Fletcher, a smile on her face as she said, "I see him. He is waiting for me and he looks so warm." They buried her beside Fletcher in the Fort Stockton Cemetery, under a large headstone that read Fletcher and Georgiana Calloway, partners in life, united in love. Their children made sure the grave was always maintained, a place where future generations could come and learn about the great-great-grandparents who had built the foundation for their entire family. The mercantile remained in the family for another generation, eventually becoming a hardware store when Henry's son took it over. The building still stood decades later, a landmark in Fort Stockton, with a plaque describing its history and the couple who had created it. But the real legacy of Fletcher and Georgiana was not in buildings or businesses. It was in the descendants who carried their genes and their values forward into the future. It was in the story told and retold at family gatherings, of the traumatized woman who stumbled into a general store on a snowy night and the kind man who promised her warmth. It was in the example they set of what love could be when two people chose each other completely and built a life based on partnership, respect, and devotion. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually spread across the country, becoming teachers and doctors and ranchers and soldiers and everything in between. But they all carried the story of Fletcher and Georgiana, the reminder that even in the darkest moments, love could appear like a miracle and transform everything. The Wild West of their youth faded into history, becoming the stuff of movies and novels. Fort Stockton continued to grow and change, the frontier town becoming a modern city. The general store where they met was eventually torn down and replaced with a gas station, then later a shopping center. The physical traces of their lives disappeared one by one. But love, real love of the kind Fletcher and Georgiana shared, never truly disappears. It echoes through time in the lives it touches and the family it creates. It lives in the stories told by firesides and at dinner tables. It survives in the values passed from generation to generation. And somewhere in the vast universe, perhaps Fletcher and Georgiana are together again, young and strong and completely in love, with all the warmth they could ever need and eternity to enjoy it. The snow that covered her tears that long ago night has melted away forever, replaced by the endless warmth of a love that transcended tragedy, time, and even death itself. Their story, which began with fear and pain and cold, ended with love and family, and the warmth of a life lived fully and well. It was not always easy, and there were challenges and sorrows along the way. But through it all, they had each other, and that made every struggle worthwhile. Fletcher kept his promise. From that first night until his last breath, he made sure Georgiana knew warmth. Not just the physical warmth of shelter and comfort, but the deeper warmth of being truly loved, of having a partner who saw her completely and chose her anyway, of building something meaningful together. And Georgiana gave him the same gift in return, filling his life with purpose and joy, and a love that made every day better than the one before. In the end, that is what mattered. Not the success of their business or the size of their family, though both were considerable. What mattered was the love they shared, the promises they kept, and the warmth they created together in a world that could be harsh and cold. They took their pain and trauma and refused to let it define them, choosing instead to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. That is the story of Fletcher Calloway and Georgiana Everett, two people who found each other in the worst possible moment and created the best possible life. It is a story of the Old West, of hardship and survival, and building something from nothing. But more than that, it is a story of love, pure and simple, the kind of love that comes once in a lifetime if you are very lucky. And they were lucky, both of them, though it did not always feel that way. Lucky to have found each other. Lucky to have had the courage to love despite their fears. lucky to have built a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Most of all, lucky to have known what it meant to truly love and be loved in return, to have a partner who made every day warmer and brighter just by existing. The Wild West passed into history, but stories like theirs lived on, reminding future generations that love and courage and kindness never go out of style, that even in the darkest winter, warmth can be found, that promises made from the heart are worth keeping, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is wipe away their tears and promise them something better. Fletcher and Georgiana's story began with snow and tears and a promise of warmth. It ended, decades later, with a legacy of love that would warm hearts for generations to come. And in between those 2 points was a lifetime of moments, both ordinary and extraordinary, that added up to something extraordinary indeed. A love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the American frontier, proving that even in the roughest times and the hardest places, love can not only survive but thrive, growing stronger with each passing year until it becomes something eternal and unbreakable, a warmth that never fades no matter how cold the world may be.